September 9th, 1998. A private screening room on the third floor of a talent agency building on Wilshire Boulevard, Los Angeles, 7:40 in the evening. The room held 14 seats and was currently occupied by one. Her name, for the purposes of this story, is Margaret Holt. She was 51 years old, a senior casting director with 22 years of credits behind her. Television pilots, mid-budget studio features, 2 films that had placed actors in awards conversations, and one that had not, a body of work she was professionally proud of and privately ambivalent about, in the way that most people who have spent 2 decades making choices are ambivalent about them in aggregate. She had asked the projectionist to stay late. She had not told him why. She had a yellow legal pad on the empty seat beside her and a pen in her hand that she had not yet used. The film running was Rush Hour, Jackie Chan. It had opened 10 days earlier, $33 million in its first weekend. The trades were calling it the biggest martial arts opening in American history. Her assistant had flagged it for her on Tuesday. She had waited until tonight to watch it alone. She had a specific reason for waiting. She had a specific reason for being alone. Both reasons were the same reason, and she had known it since the moment the box office numbers crossed her desk. To understand who Margaret Holt was in 1984, which is when this story actually starts, 14 years before that screening room, you need to understand what casting directors did and did not control in the American film industry of that era. They controlled access, not decisions, exactly, but the architecture of who got considered. A producer or a director decided who was hired. A casting director decided who was seen. The distinction sounds procedural. In practice, it was the difference between a performer existing in the industry's consciousness and not existing in it. The list of names that landed on a producer's desk had been assembled, filtered, shaped by someone in a room like the one Margaret Holt occupied. If your name was not on that list, the producer never knew to want you. If the list maker had a theory about what the producer wanted, that theory shaped the list, and the list shaped the film, and the film, if it performed, became evidence that the theory was correct. Margaret Holt had a theory in 1984. It was not her theory alone. It was the industry's theory, widely held, rarely examined, functional in the way that a scaffolding is functional, load-bearing until you try to build something outside its dimensions. The theory, stated plainly, was this. American mainstream audiences would follow an Asian performer in a supporting role, a character role, a role that did not require them to carry the film's emotional or commercial weight. They would not follow an Asian performer as the lead of an action film, not a genuinely, unambiguously Asian-identified performer, not someone whose Asianness was the primary visible fact about them rather than a background detail. This was not stated as prejudice, it was stated as market research, it was supported by data, box office data from the 1970s and early 80s, and data in that industry, in that era, was close to unanswerable. In 1984, Margaret Holt received a submission. The submission came through a production company that was attempting, again, to broker an American deal for a Hong Kong performer who had been, for the previous 6 years, the most commercially successful action star in Asia. The reel that arrived on her desk contained footage from several films. One of them was Police Story, which had not yet been released. This was pre-production material, rough cuts, the shopping mall sequence that would later become the most discussed practical stunt in Hong Kong cinema that year. She watched it. What she saw, a man of about 35 feet 9, broad-shouldered, with a face that communicated things simultaneously and contradictorily, danger and comedy in the same expression, pain that registered as humor without losing its reality as pain. She watched him slide down a pole wrapped in electrical lights and land badly enough that the people around him, the ones you could see at the edges of the frame who were not performing, visibly flinched. She watched him look at the camera in the immediate aftermath with an expression she could not quite categorize. Not triumph, not suffering. Something between the two that had no clean name. She watched it twice. Then she wrote a note on her legal pad. This is documented in an account she gave years later. In a trade publication interview, she agreed to on the condition that certain details remain off the record, and the note said something like, "Extraordinary physical, comic timing. The face is the problem." She meant, by the face, not the face itself. She meant what the face communicated. She meant that the quality she was watching, the vulnerability, the humor, the refusal to perform in vulnerability, was not, by her theory, what the American market wanted from an action lead. It was not the coiled menace that had made Bruce Lee internationally viable. It was something else, something she recognized as genuine and commercially legible in theory, but could not fit into the architecture of American action cinema as she understood it. She passed. The submission went to 2 other casting directors at 2 other agencies, by the account of the production company representative who was making the rounds with it. Both passed. The reasons given were variations on a theme, not the right fit for the current market, timing, difficult to position, the specific vocabulary of a system gently declining without wanting to articulate precisely why. I want to be careful here, because the way I first understood Margaret Holt's decision was wrong in a way that took me a while to identify. When I first read the account of the 1984 pass, my reaction was uncomplicated. I thought, here is a gatekeeper who got it wrong, who looked at something extraordinary and couldn't see it because the framework she was working with had a blind spot the size of a continent. And that reading is not false. It is genuinely true that the framework had a blind spot. It is genuinely true that the pass cost the American market 14 years of a career it could have had earlier. All of that is real. But the longer I sat with it, the more I kept returning to a detail from that trade interview. She said she watched the shopping mall footage twice. She said she wrote the note, and she said, and this is the part I couldn't stop thinking about, that she kept the note, that the legal pad it was written on stayed in a file in her desk drawer, not because she was sentimental about it, but because she could not, at the time or for years afterward, fully explain to herself why she kept it. The note was a pass. The pass was final. The legal pad should have gone in the bin. She kept it anyway. Something about that detail is not the behavior of a person who simply didn't see what was in front of them. That is the behavior of a person who saw something and didn't know what to do with it. Actually, I need to go back, because I've been building toward a version of this story that isn't quite complete, and I want to fix that before we go further. The submission in 1984 was not the only one. There were others, in 1982, in 1986, after Armor of God, in 1988. The production companies and agents who believed in Jackie Chan's American potential kept trying, kept sending reels, kept finding different framings and different entry points into the same conversation. The submissions reached different people. Some reached Margaret Holt, some didn't. What is consistent across all of them, across the full arc of that 14-year period, is the shape of the response, acknowledgement of the physical gifts, acknowledgement of the commercial performance in Asian markets, and then the pivot, the market language pivot, the demographic pivot, the industry consensus sentence that closed the door without admitting it was a door. What I want to be honest about is that I don't know exactly how many times Margaret Holt specifically was part of that response. The accounts are partial. Her own account, from the one interview I was able to access, covers 1984 in detail and then jumps forward. The years in between are not described. I am filling in a shape from the outside, and I want you to know that is what I am doing. What I know is this. By 1995, when Rumble in the Bronx opened and the North American numbers came back and the industry had its first unmistakable evidence that the theory had been wrong, Margaret Holt was still working. She was still in the same building, still assembling lists for producers, still making the calls that determined who got seen and who did not. The world had just changed underneath her in a specific and documented way, and she had watched it change from her office on Wilshire Boulevard. The production records from the rush hour shoot in Los Angeles in the spring of 1998 confirm the location and the timeline. What they don't record is what it was like to be inside the American film industry's machinery as it processed what was happening to it. Jackie Chan, 44 years old, 27 years in the industry, with a skull fracture from Yugoslavia still documented in his medical history, and a plastic plug covering the permanent hole it had left, with a broken ankle that had been painted over to finish a film, and a pelvis that had been dislocated during a mall stunt that the American market had declined to see for over a decade, was standing on a Los Angeles soundstage in the flat bleaching light of a California afternoon, directing his own fight sequences because the union rules were an adjustment, and he had spent 20 years being simultaneously the director, the star, the stunt coordinator, and the fight choreographer on productions that had no budget for the American system's division of labor. He was there because the theory had finally been forced to confront the evidence, not because the evidence had changed. The evidence, the physical gifts, the comic timing, the face that communicated pain as humor without losing its reality as pain, had been the same since at least 1978, since Drunken Master had broken Hong Kong box office records, and the American industry had been informed of this fact and had found reasons not to act on the information. The evidence had not changed. The theory had run out of room to ignore it. He said something, in an interview around this period, that I have been carrying around since I first read it. He said, "I'm not a superstar. I'm a professional comedian, but the comedy happens to involve broken bones." He said it lightly, with the particular matter-of-factness of someone who has been through enough that dressing things up feels like a waste of everyone's time. The humor and the pain in the same sentence. The face on the legal pad, 14 years later, finally on a Los Angeles soundstage, saying the true thing about himself as if it were obvious, which of course it always had been. "There is something I want you to sit with here, before I take you back to that screening room on Wilshire Boulevard. It is not a comfortable thing, and I am not going to make it comfortable." The theory that kept Jackie Chan out of the American market for 14 years was not invented by Margaret Holt. It was not invented by any single person. It was assembled, gradually and collectively, from the decisions and assumptions and data readings of an industry that had built its commercial logic around a specific, narrow, predominantly white image of what an action hero was and what an action hero's face was allowed to communicate. The data that supported the theory was real data. The early 1980s crossover attempts had genuinely failed commercially, but the data was also the product of the theory, because the films that failed had been made inside the theory's constraints, had been stripped of the specific qualities that made Jackie Chan Jackie Chan, had been shaped by people who believed the theory and therefore made films that confirmed it. The theory ate its own evidence. It produced failures and read the failures as proof. Margaret Holt was not the architect of this. She was a competent professional doing her job inside a system whose assumptions she had inherited rather than constructed. I want to be straight about that, because the easier version of this story makes her the villain, and she was not the villain. She was the system, in the way that individuals are sometimes the system. Not malicious, not stupid, not incapable of seeing what was in front of her, but unable to act on what she saw because the architecture of her professional world had no framework for it. She kept the legal pad, though. That detail has not left me. Something in her knew that the note represented a gap between what the theory said and what the footage showed. She kept the evidence of that gap in a drawer for 14 years. I want to ask you something directly, and I genuinely like your answer in the comments because I have been going back and forth on this for longer than I expected. When Margaret Holt sat in that screening room on September 9, 1998, watching Rush Hour alone, the legal pad on the seat beside her, the pen uncapped, the film unspooling, what do you think she wrote? I don't mean that rhetorically. I mean, do you think she wrote anything at all? Do you think she sat there with the pen and found she had nothing to put on the paper? Because the distance between what she had written in 1984 and what was on that screen in 1998 was not a distance that notation could bridge. Or do you think she wrote something very specific, something that acknowledged what the 1984 note had and hadn't understood, something in the private shorthand of a person settling an account with themselves? I think about the specific quality of that room. 14 seats, one person. The sound of the projector, The LA evening outside the windows she couldn't see. The film running without an audience except her. Jackie Chan's face on the screen doing the thing she had noted in 1984, pain as humor, vulnerability without collapse for an American audience that had finally been allowed to see it and had responded emphatically by showing up. Tell me what you think she wrote, I mean it. What I am about to tell you is the part of this story that reframes everything that came before it, and I want to be clear that it is a reframe I arrived at later than I should have. Probably, if I had been reading the evidence more carefully from the beginning. I spent a long time understanding this story as a story about rejection. A performer with a specific and extraordinary set of gifts, turned away repeatedly by a system that could not see past its own framework. That story is true, but it is not the complete story, and the part it leaves out is the part that turns out to matter most. In those 14 years, the years between the first American submission and the American breakthrough, Jackie Chan was not waiting, he was working. He was making Police Story and burning his hands on the electrical pole and dislocating his pelvis on the landing and doing it again until the shot was right. He was making Armor of God in Yugoslavia in 1986 and falling from a tree and fracturing his skull and having emergency surgery in a country where he couldn't speak the language, coming back from that with a plug in his skull and continuing. He was making film after film after film for audiences in Hong Kong and across Asia, building a body of work so large and so fully realized that by the time the American market finally turned to look at it, it was not a potential to be evaluated, but a fact to be reckoned with. The rejection did not stop him. The rejection was, in a specific structural sense, irrelevant to him, not because it didn't sting, not because the closed American door didn't represent real commercial limitation, but because he had not organized his professional life around the American door. He had organized it around the work. The theory being pressed against him in Burbank had no purchase because he was not in Burbank. He was in Hong Kong, and then Yugoslavia, and then Vancouver, finishing a film on a broken ankle, building something that didn't need the theory's permission to be real. When the American market finally received him, it was not because he had changed to fit the framework. The framework had been cracked open by the weight of evidence he had accumulated while the framework was busy declining to see him. He walked through the gap, not as someone who had been waiting for permission, but as someone who had never needed it, who had spent 14 years making himself into something so incontrovertibly present that even a screening room in Burbank, in the bleaching flat light of a California September evening, couldn't argue with it anymore. Margaret Holt watched the film. She had 14 seats, and she occupied one of them. She had the legal pad and the uncapped pen, and whatever she wrote or didn't write, the story was not about her anymore. It had not been about her for a long time. The story was about what gets built in the years when the door is closed, in the specific and accumulating weight of work done for its own sake, in the permanent hole in a skull and the painted cast on an ankle, and the thing that keeps coming through regardless of what the theory requires it to be. The story was about what happens when a person is constitutionally unable to organize their life around someone else's permission. The note on the legal pad said, "The face is the problem." The face was never the problem. The face was always the whole point. And 14 years later, on a screen in a dark room on Wilshire Boulevard, with $33 million of opening weekend behind it, and an audience that had finally been allowed to decide for itself, the face was doing exactly what it had always done, holding the pain and the humor simultaneously, refusing to collapse one into the other, communicating at every moment the true and specific and irreplaceable thing that it had always been communicating, that there was only one of him, that this was what he actually was, that the only question had ever been whether the room was ready to see it. The room in September of 1998 finally was.